Hey everyone, and welcome to the Sunny Go One Piece podcast. On this episode, we're going to be diving into episodes 656 through 658, which will cover manga chapters 725 through 726. And that's right, you heard that right. We are now at the point where we're only adapting 2 chapters for every 3 episodes, or an average of 2/3 of a chapter per episode. And this is where you really start to feel the terrible pacing of Dressrosa come into effect, and you start to feel it. I certainly do. And but even though we still do get quite a bit of exciting new information and lore in these episodes about Dressrosa, the Tontatta, and a bit of history in general of the One Piece world as well. So it is an interesting episode, but yeah, just the pacing has just gone down the tubes. It's so bad. But anyways, let's get into the synopsis. So, as the Straw Hats regroup and figure out how to reconnect with each other in preparation for the upcoming battle, we keep learning even more about the horrors of Dressrosa, the Don Quixote family, and Doflamingo himself, and how that's affected the lives of the Tontatta, the citizens of Dressrosa, the gladiators, as well as our characters that we've met so far, like the Toy Soldier and Rebecca as well. So, differences. There are a few differences, not quite as many as the last episode, but obviously with so much filler, there are maybe less actual instances of differences, but the differences are huge. I guess the first one is on the Sunny in episode 650. Man, that is hard to say. Episode 656. The conversation with Brook about watching the clouds is a little longer, with Brook making more jokes and Nami blasting him away with the wind. This is all inserted into that scene. Now, obviously, the general scene of Nami being paranoid about the clouds to keep Doflamingo away, that's all there. But all this stuff with Brook has been added to in the anime. Another change is the anime adds filler scenes of Rolling Logan fighting a bit more, with flashbacks of Rebecca training with the Toy Soldier, which are not in the manga. This is one of the bigger problems I mentioned with the Dressrosa arc in general, is whenever they need to buy time, and whenever Rebecca's on screen, Toei will never miss a chance to insert a flashback of Rebecca thinking about her time with the Toy Soldier. It happens so much. The manga part resumes when the announcer starts to compliment her with the double negative statements. And episode 656 is mostly filler. Like, I'm talking like 85% of this episode is entirely filler. Like, the first 8 minutes of Bartolomeo walking around looking for Luffy is entirely added filler. But it is pretty funny when he runs through the Straw Hat members in his mind and bases them off of their appearance from their pre-time skip wanted posters. And he imagines Sanji in this sort of messed up Duval portrait, which was pretty fun. But it kind of gets back on track when we see the makeshift infirmary with Sai kind of walking up to the attendant asking what's going on. Of course, the big one, most of Rebecca versus Rolling Logan is filler, as well as the prisoners telling Luffy about how kind Rebecca is. In fact, they go so far as to change entirely how Rolling Logan is defeated in the anime. In the manga, he's not defeated till much later, and not by Rebecca, but instead he's actually defeated by Cavendish, which, again, I don't really want to spoil how he's defeated, because that's still a spoiler. But yeah, just know that Rebecca doesn't defeat Rolling Logan. Cavendish ends up doing it later on. With that, let's get into the episodes themselves. We last left off with Law and Doflamingo facing off against each other on the bridge between Greenbit and Dressrosa, and while we don't get to see much of this fight, we do learn a bit more and more about what is driving Law, as it's slowly becoming apparent that there's another reason that Law is here on Dressrosa, and it seems to be to avenge someone. But Law makes a clear distinction that it's not revenge he's after, but he's trying to accomplish someone's long-cherished ambition, or another way to put it is to carry on someone's will, which we all know is a very significant thing for any character in One Piece. It's at this point I started to think that we might actually get a flashback for Law in this arc, which is an exciting prospect because he is a very mysterious yet cool character that we all want to learn more about. Back on the Sunny, as the crew are in the process of getting away, they're trying to determine what to do next, but Sanji, ever the observant and kind guy, notices Momo is shaking and back in his dragon form. And this is where we learn why Momo is so terrified of Doflamingo and why he freaked out in that trash chute at Punk Hazard when he first met Luffy and he sort of thought back to Doflamingo. Now, during this mini flashback, you really just see the depths of Doflamingo's cruelty, evil, and bloodlust as he treats his gladiators as kind of objects for entertainment, telling one as he drowns him, if you can't kill anyone, then get yourself killed and spill some blood. We also really learn his twisted worldview of people, that everyone has this sort of primal lust for blood and will get excited when seeing it, which is clearly not true. As Doflamingo slashes this poor guy, Momo is immediately traumatized and faints, which is horrifying for a 7-year-old child to have to witness. And this flashback is also where we first hear Kanjuro's voice as we hear him, but we are still unable to see him as he's still obscured in the shadows. But it is interesting to finally actually meet Kanjuro in essence. Of course, Sanji has to ruin this moment for Momo by completely daydreaming about Violet as he's kind of explaining this to him. But we see in this scene that post-time skip Sanji actually is good at pulling women. They aren't just like disregarding him, as we see Violet kind of smitten, or at the very least admires Sanji and his kindness. And when you think about it, the past 2 arcs have been this case as well. As in Fishman Island, the girls of the Mermaid Cafe were all really into Sanji, and even Monet was briefly swayed by Sanji's compliments in Punk Hazard. So perhaps his time on Momoiro Island with Ivankov really did change something within Sanji and how he sort of behaves around women, at least a little bit, that now they respond to him in a more positive way at least. And it's not to take away from his pre-time skip. Like, he was still like flirting with women. Like, even back to his introduction, like with the with Full Body's date, he was actually like getting her into him and taking her away from Full Body. So it's not like he was like bad with women, but as the series progressed, you started to see more and more women just kind of like disregard him, particularly Nami and Robin, obviously. But you even saw it with like other random women too, like Nojiko and in Tashigi and all that stuff. So yeah, it is interesting to see sort of Sanji's sort of evolution in terms of how women react to him, how they perceive him. Another interesting bit we learn about Violet is that when the people were bad-mouthing Rebecca watching the broadcast of the D-Block fight, she gets angry and blasts it, showing us that she has some relation to Rebecca, or at the very least is a fan of hers. And then this is followed up by her requesting to be taken to the palace, which kind of indicates that perhaps she's related to Rebecca in some way, maybe an older sister. Now, just watching the manga, it might be a little bit of a stretch to come to this conclusion, or not the manga, but the anime. If you watched it in the anime, it might be a stretch to come to this conclusion, but in the manga, Oda actually emphasizes certain words by including little dots alongside particular words or kanji that he really wants the reader to take note of. In the English manga translations, I believe they try to bold these words, and in this situation, Oda really emphasizes the word palace, and kind of drawing your attention to that sort of the connection with royalty and the royal family. And so this is, seeing this makes you really think, oh, maybe this has something to do with her being royalty, and then obviously then that would kind of connect you to Rebecca. Now, speaking of Rebecca and the D-Block fight in the Colosseum, though, we return to the situation just outside of it with Zoro, Kinemon, and Bartolomeo. And this interaction always freaking brings a smile to my face whenever he's fanboying over the Straw Hats. And his faces he makes and his inability to have a coherent conversation with Zoro is so damn funny. He even goes so far as to ask for his autograph, which is exactly what any of us would do in this situation whenever we run into like a celebrity that we love, or if we were to ever meet the Straw Hats, if they were real. And yeah, it's one of my favorite lines from this entire scene is when Zoro tasks him with finding and bringing Luffy to them, and he's sort of like on cloud 9, running around saying, "It's like I've become Luffy Senpai's right hand's right hand." And it's been a while since I've laughed this hard at One Piece, but Bartolomeo is such a meta character because Oda is channeling all of us, the fans, in a meta way. We are Bartolomeo, so we become the right hand of the right hand of the right hand, which is really funny. And it kind of allows us to kind of participate in the story, which is a really fun sort of thought when it comes to reading Bartolomeo. And that's kind of one of the reasons why I think a lot of fans really love Bartolomeo and why I love him. One other interesting point about this interaction is how Bartolomeo calls Zoro the vice captain. And this has been somewhat of a point of contention among the fan base, I feel like, for a while, up until more recently. The question of whether Zoro is actually the vice captain or the first mate of the Straw Hat Pirates. For years, it's been debated whether Zoro is or isn't, and while we do have an official answer from Oda, now, I think even before that, from a philosophical and thematic standpoint of how Luffy likes to operate, it really wouldn't make sense for Luffy to want an actual hierarchy in his crew anyways. So, like, I've always had the opinion where it's like, Zoro is not a first mate. Like, he never had that position. I don't think Luffy would want that position. And often Zoro is referred to in sort of like materials in when they list out the crew. He's either listed as the Kenshi or the swordsman or the Kentoshi or like the fighter. And yeah, because Luffy is all about freedom and allowing his crew members autonomy to do as they wish for the most part. So aside from himself as the captain, there is no further chain of command, as that would kind of go against that philosophy. As we've seen time and time again in many examples, Luffy will actually defer to whoever is best suited or necessary to lead. Luffy is a master at delegating. Like in combat situations, he will turn to Zoro and Sanji and trust them completely. And when it comes to the sort of the day-to-day running of the ship and navigation, Nami often takes the lead. And when it comes to sort of like the medical side of the ship or repairing the ship, obviously Chopper and Frankie respectively take command in those situations. And so, yeah, for Luffy to have someone that stands above them doesn't really make sense. And when you think about this, it makes Luffy's crew incredibly powerful in that no matter what happens or whoever is incapacitated or unavailable, there's always someone capable of taking over and making sure things get done, and that the crew can make it out safely. Unlike many crews, the Straw Hat Pirates are insanely adaptable and mobile. Unlike when you look at like the Marines, which are the polar opposite of this approach, where everything is incredibly rigid and hierarchical, and if any of the commanding officers go down, an entire crew is kind of left in disarray. Like you see a lot of the normal grunts or even the captains and all that stuff, like they're kind of just lost a little bit whenever that sort of the vice admiral goes down or whatever. Putting all that aside, though, we got an official answer from Oda in Volume 102's SBS in response to a question about a color spread that Oda did for Chapter 1031, which depicted many of the major crew's number 2 crew members, and in it, the fan asks about Beppo, Law's number 2, being featured as the number 2 of the Heart Pirates, instead of like, say, Penguin or Shachi. And in Oda's response, he mentions that like Zoro, not all characters featured on that color spread have the title of first mate. And while Penguin and Shachi are more dependable, they recognize that Beppo's strengths is far outpacing theirs, and so they defer to him as the number 2, essentially. Now, I don't recommend looking this answer up, as I have omitted some spoiler things, so unless you want to be spoiled by some of that other stuff, you'll just have to take my word for it right now. But that's essentially the answer that Oda gave, is that, yeah, Zoro does not have the title. Once we get to episode 657, I'd say about, like I said, 85% of this episode is entirely filler, or at least drawn out sequences of what's in the manga. One of the actual few canon scenes we get is an important one, as we learn what happens to the losers of the Colosseum. They're not treated, but instead drop down into a trash pit, the same one that they've been throwing the rebellious toys into. The mystery further thickens as to what Doflamingo is up to by capturing all these powerful fighters. The canon material from this episode are the brief interactions that Rebecca has fighting Rolling Logan, but in the manga there's probably a little over a page of actual canon material. And I do like that added bit of information showing how kind Rebecca is, that she helped to actually treat some of the injured gladiators, which was never shown in the manga. I do like that added stuff because, yeah, that seems like something that she would do. And like I mentioned in the differences section, the anime devotes a huge amount of screen time to Achillea and Rolling Logan and Rebecca, and it even goes as far as completely changing how Rolling Logan is defeated. In the anime, it's shown that Rolling Logan is defeated by Rebecca here by knocking him off the stage. but in the manga, Rolling Logan isn't defeated till much later and by Cavendish, someone else entirely. So there is one other canon, an important moment in episode 657, and that's at the very end where Luffy also begins to notice the dichotomy in Dressrosa in terms of what's presented on the surface and the darkness that's buried underneath. Even remarking how it reminds him of his home, the Goa Kingdom, how they have this sort of beautiful city and they tried to make it look beautiful for the world noble and the celestial dragon coming into town at the time, with all the rich people in one section of the island, which is the front-facing part of it, and all the poor and sick people separated into another part of the island with all the trash in the Great Terminal. And this is significant for a couple of reasons. It foreshadows or preps the viewer for two things. Firstly, this will be a chance for Luffy to actually do something this time. The last time with his home, Goa Kingdom, and the Great Terminal, he was just a kid. He couldn't do anything to save his home or the people of the Great Terminal and the people that he loved. Not only that, though, it was the reason it led to his brother Sabo dying. This is Luffy's chance to symbolically right the wrongs of the past and save a country that is suffering the same way his home was, which is significant. And while I don't know that this is the approach that Luffy took, it's certainly not lost on anyone else. While it is very understated and subtle, this creates a very personal stake for Luffy and us, the viewer, in this conflict, and it makes Dressrosa's tension that much more palpable because this means even more to Luffy than many other arcs. Most of the time, he's fighting for the sake of others, like the friends he's met at these islands that need his help. But this time, there's a bit more of a personal stake in it for him, even if it means it's symbolic. And it means more to him, I feel like. Especially because the second bit of foreshadowing / preparation this scene does, which leads right into it, but I can't speak on this aspect just yet, as it involves a heavy spoiler for the rest of this arc, but trust me, it's a doozy. And I'll touch on this in the spoiler section, but yeah, it kind of gets you prepared for a different sort of setup. But following this scene, though, we finally get the long-awaited meeting between Bartolomeo and his idol and hero, Luffy. And it doesn't disappoint. And this is one of those areas where I have no issues with anime filler because they do such an amazing job with this hilarious scene between the voice acting for Bartolomeo, how he says, Luffy senpai, and not to mention the Hancock like fantasizing of Luffy into the sort of the shoujo manga style. He's got these like big, beautiful eyes and the sparkliness and more of the rigid lines. and even Mayumi Tanaka plays Luffy with a deeper voice in the fantasy, which is such a nice touch. The next episode, we catch back up with defeated gladiators stuck in the trash pit, and we finally get the reveal that the gladiator Ricky is actually the former King Riku of Dressrosa after one of his former captains, Tank, starts to suspect that he is his former king. So my theory that Ricky was Kyros went out the window there with this reveal, but it was at this point with this reveal that there was no doubt in my mind who Kyros was, because who else could it have been? But more on that near the end of this episode, and I'll get into that. This scene was far more emotional than I thought, and even now, rewatching and rereading it, this scene had a lot of emotional power to it, even though I don't really know most of these characters all that well yet. I think that has a lot to do with how well Oda has been building the sort of the world and sort of the world building of Dressrosa and sort of the underside of Dressrosa. This sense, like when you watch and read Dressrosa, there's this sense of like discomfort feeling of like dread that's been percolating through this entire time, and you read it and you're just like constantly like kind of uncomfortable with just how things are because everything feels so fake, and there's just this overall sense of dread that seems to permeate throughout the entire arc. And so when Tank breaks down at the news that his king was alive, but not only that, he forgives and understands why he's been serving Doflamingo all this time, despite his continued loyalty to King Riku. It was like really powerful, and especially when you learn that it was so he could watch over and protect Viola. But at first you're like, who's Viola? And I didn't even immediately catch on to this when I first read it, but you can't help but notice how similar the names Violet and Viola sound. That combined with the heavy hinting by Oda that Violet is a royal. And you had one of two options at this point in my mind. Violet had a sister named Viola, or that Violet is Viola herself, that she's just disguising her name. And I won't spoil which one it is in case you don't know, because I don't know that you could quite make the determination here, and it wasn't quite as obvious as some of the other things that you could predict. And I just like this scene because it finally shows us some good vibes, despite all the uncomfortable, shadowy stuff that's been going on, and realize that all these people you thought were villains or at least antagonists were slowly starting to be revealed as good people, including people like King Elisabello, who it turns out is an old friend of King Riku. But it's then broken up by the revelation of the true depths of Doflamingo's evil manipulation, that it wasn't just Dressrosa, but countless other kingdoms around the area he has been controlling and pitting them against each other by feeding them weapons and having them instigate conflicts between each other, all so that he could commit war profiteering by engineering his own wars, creating demand for his own weapons. Then we get the big punch where the remaining other soldiers, but not only them, but the toys, who were also former members of the royal army, all bowed down for their king, confusing everyone else why they still would have so much respect for a supposed disgraced king that perpetrated some sort of a treasonous act in the past. And it's an awesome scene that I just love, pretty much simply on vibes alone. But now there's yet another faction of soldiers who are willing to fight against Doflamingo in the upcoming battle. And it's a really cool moment, I feel like, because now you've got, like, obviously the Straw Hats, you've got the Tontatta tribe and the toy soldier, and now you've got this other faction of potential prisoners and toys who were cast away by Doflamingo, as well as the former royal army and King Riku now. So you're starting to see like all these different factions really start to come together into this sort of big, huge battle that might come about later on at the climax of the arc. However, this wholesome moment is abruptly interrupted by Treble plucking Sai out of the prison pit and transforming him into a toy and giving him instructions to never hurt humans and always obeying the Don Quixote family. Now, this is an interesting sort of addition to whatever this power is that turns people into toys, that you can, once you turn them into toys, you can give them specific instructions that they cannot disobey, which is really interesting because it also makes you wonder like how the toy soldier is able to sort of do all this stuff without being controlled by the powers. Of course, we don't really know how that's happening, but it could be some sort of a different thing with him. And this is such a diabolical setup that Doflamingo has created to lure potentially strong fighters, basically anyone who might have the power to oppose him, and have them fight each other, only to then capture them after they're weakened and turn them into his toy slaves. And no one will miss them due to them being forgotten by the power of that fruit. One thing about this scene that you might be confused about if you watch this in the anime only is that it's presented to you as if Treble is the one who has the power to turn people into toys. And if you were reading the manga, that's what you're supposed to believe, so that when it actually is revealed that Sugar is the one with the power, it's a wild subversion of expectations to see this cute little girl is actually the scary ass threat and not this creepy old street pimp looking guy. However, the anime, because it treats its audience like they're idiots, already showed us Sugar's barely covered silhouette as the one with the power to turn people into toys during Violet's explanation earlier in a few episodes back. So this scene is completely meaningless, and not only that, it's just dumb the way it's portrayed, where there's no reason to hide the fact that Sugar is the one doing this and make you think that it's Treble. But they had to adapt this scene this way because that's how it's done in the manga. Unlike the reveal that the toy soldier is Rebecca, who is her father, which, like I've said, many people could figure out pretty easily, which interestingly enough is officially revealed at the end of this episode, is because Oda is leaving hints so you might try and figure that out. But in the case of Treble and Sugar, Oda's intent is to actively try to lead you towards a different path in order to surprise you with a twist later on. And so by basically revealing that Sugar is already a possessor of the fruit, this scene makes no sense the way it's presented. Like, why is the story trying to trick us when it's already told us that it's not Treble? Anyways, you see, this is why you don't deviate that wildly from the source material, especially when it comes to reveals of key information that Oda deems necessary to hide until the time is right. To cap this set of episodes off, back at the hideout under the flower garden, we get some more lore and world building surrounding Dressrosa and the Tontatta from Gancho, the Tontatta chief. We get the first mention of the era of slaves and how the Tontatta were enslaved by the Don Quixote family for several hundred years, all the way up until the end of the Void Century, until the Don Quixote left to become world nobles atop the Red Line in Marijua, when the Riku family would then come in and take over, rule, ushering a new age of peace, essentially. And this is also the first mention of the era of slaves and a bit more information of the times around the Ancient Kingdom and the Void Century. Now, we're not given much information around that, but definitely keep this filed away as we learn more and more about the history of One Piece and sort of the timeline of events surrounding the Void Century around that time. One thing I really love about this is how it ties into the whole culture and myth of the fairies. At first glance, near the beginning of the arc, it just seems like a quirky aspect of Dressrosa culture that people just believe in these fairies that just occasionally steal things from you, and was a way to explain, the people's relationship to the Tontatta, who would eventually be introduced and ally with our main characters, and usually in most stories, especially ones aimed towards younger audiences, would end there. But Oda always takes it one step further and ties it back and gives a solid reason for that belief and behavior. It turns out because the original King Riku and the Riku family were so kind that they wanted to apologize to the Tontatta people for what the Don Quixote family were doing to them. So in atonement, he allowed them to basically take anything they wanted and convince the people of Dressrosa that this was the doing of mythical fairies and that this was just a way of honoring and paying respects to the land. And in essence, that's exactly what happened, because as a result, the Tontatta tribe, because they were thriving, the vegetation and greenery of the Greenbit and Dressrosa parts of the island, they also thrived as well, creating this sort of very symbiotic and beneficial relationship. It's like how the Shandians in Skypiea prayed to the gods to save their sick people, and essentially we later found out that it's the trees, and since that was actually making them sick, even if they didn't know it at the time, and what they did was, instead of offering up little trinkets and items, they offered up human sacrifices. But in this case, citizens of Dressrosa were, they were willing to offer up random items to be stolen by the fairies so that their land can flourish. And interestingly, the person that happened to save both people, the Tontatta and the Shandians, was Mont Blanc Noland, which is also an interesting parallel when you really look at both stories of how they sort of approach that sort of the mythical side of things. Now, at the end of this episode, we do get the official reveal that the toy soldier is in fact Rebecca's father, but I don't know anyone who didn't see this coming like a mile away, which is why I didn't even bother to hide it behind spoilers. But like I mentioned earlier in the episode, how with the reveal that Ricky was not Kyros, and it is in fact King Riku, the only other person in my mind when I was reading this was that the toy soldier, Rebecca's father, was Kyros. And the reason no one can seem to remember him is because he's now a toy. Something went wrong that night, that Scarlet was killed, which is why the toy soldier came back or why Kyros came back as the toy soldier with Scarlet. And that's also why it explains why he knew where Rebecca was hiding. And I was pretty proud of myself for this prediction back in the day, although I was a little disappointed shortly thereafter, as it turned out a lot of people figured this one out pretty easily as well, so wasn't quite as impressive as I first thought. I was like, I remember being really proud of myself. I was like, oh, the toy soldier is definitely Kyros. And then it was just like, oh, I guess everybody figured this out too, or at least that was their theory at the time. But anyways, lastly, during the scene in the trash pit, we can see Hack has a mini Dendemushi and he's communicating with a girl on the outside, and it looks like they're also investigating something in the underground, potentially also looking for the Smile Factory or the Weapons Factory or both, which are seemingly hidden somewhere underneath the Colosseum, which is what everybody's looking for. And who they are is a complete mystery at the moment, but it is interesting to see that there is a third faction essentially on here trying to accomplish the same goals as everybody. So potentially Dressrosa is being set up to be like this all-out like war, essentially, and it is exciting despite how slow it is getting there. Anyways, that's pretty much everything I wanted to talk about here in this episode. So if you did enjoy this, send me a like or comment. And if you want to join me on this journey of rewatching One Piece, please consider subscribing. Check out my Instagram account at SunnyGo Podcast for updates on when I post new episodes and to see some pictures of my manga collection and card collection. And as always, I wanted to thank you for taking the time out to listen to the podcast. Small spoiler section, like I mentioned earlier. But if you're not interested in that, stay safe out there, and I hope to see you on the next episode. Bye! All right, two little things I wanted to talk about in the spoilers section. It's not going to be a very long one, but I think first off, it's really interesting to see like Momonosuke kind of sad and concerned for Kanjuro at this point in the story, and especially knowing that Kanjuro will eventually betray them and even hold Momo hostage, as well as like beating the living hell out of him till his face basically deforms later on as he delivers him to Kaido. And it's just kind of sad to see like how kind Momonosuke is and like showing genuine concern for his supposed friend, to then the sort of the shock betrayal that Kanjuro, because for me it was pretty shocking. I know there were some people that figured it out that Kanjuro was going to be the traitor among the Akazaya 9, but yeah, it's for me, it was a pretty big shock. And like going back and seeing these scenes now, it is really interesting just to see like how much concern that Momo and Kinemon had for Kanjuro. And so like the betrayal hits that much harder when it does happen, especially at that specific moment, because so much was going on. Like the Oden flashback had just completed, and you're seeing all of that and seeing just sort of the camaraderie that had built, that they had survived all of this. And they were then sent to the future, and then they survived all of this happening with Dressrosa, as well as Zoe that comes up next, and everything that's led up to that moment where Kanjuro was going to be this, like, you know, one of the people that they can count on, and then to see them betray that, and it was just, yeah, it was kind of a shock for me. And like, yeah, just seeing these moments of like Momo and Kinemon being really concerned for Kanjuro, just like, oh, you guys don't need to show him this much compassion. But yeah, obviously the other big thing, the spoiler that I wanted to talk about, is how Oda does kind of start to lay the seeds for Sabo's return. So he talks like Luffy remembers Goa Kingdom and all of that, and then obviously we see Huck and Koala kind of be introduced in this scene too, and so you see all these different pieces coming together to kind of almost subconsciously get you ready for Sabo's return, which is a very interesting. It's not something I noticed until I did a reread or rewatch on this, because obviously for me, like Sabo's return caught me by complete surprise. Like you knew Sabo was going to come back, because you knew he was alive, but I didn't think he was going to come back in this way, in this moment. And so yeah, it's interesting to see Oda lay sort of those sort of subconscious seeds for you. It's like, oh, it is Sabo. And yeah, I really like that. And as controversial as Sabo's return is among the fan base and the community, I loved the scene where Sabo returns and Luffy finds out for the first time. It still hits me hard, and I don't necessarily want to get too far into this because we're going to talk about that in the next, I think probably in 2 podcast episodes or so is when his return comes back. But yeah, that scene is, I think it's amazing. I loved it. And so yeah, I'm very excited to talk about Sabo's return. And because that's also the point where things really start to kick into gear, and sort of the act 2 of Dressrosa finally starts to wind down a little bit. And we start getting into sort of the action and the climax and third act of Dressrosa. So yeah, definitely we'll be looking forward to that. But yeah, that's all I kind of wanted to talk about. But thanks for sticking around and listening, and I hope to see you on the next episode. See ya.